Hello everybody, you're listening to Understanding Happiness, Science and the Buddha. This is the 4th episode of the podcast, and this podcast is about the topic of happiness. Not just understanding it, but also giving practical advice and wisdom on how to achieve it. But the thing with this podcast is that it's not just using the most up-to-date, reliable scientific research. We're integrating the sciences here with the humanities. What does that mean? It means that while we are using lots of scientific fields and scientific perspectives, we're combining that with thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from various philosophers, belief systems, and other theorists. And we're finding the overlap between the wisdom of the sciences and the wisdom of the humanities. And in that overlap, in integrating these different disciplines, we get this comprehensive, interdisciplinary answer on how to tackle this massive concept that is happiness. Now, this is a 5-episode series, each episode dealing with a different piece of the puzzle here. Episode 1 is about conceptualizing our own mind and kind of figuring out how can we, as the quote to the Oracle at Delphi says, know thyself. How do we really do that? How do we understand our own heads? Episode 2 is about where happiness actually comes from. Why does it even exist? How does it evolve? And the role in sociality, morality, and self-transcendence in acquiring it. The last episode, episode 3, was about the scientific study of happiness. What do the sciences have to say about this grand topic? How do I identify what happiness actually is? And how does the scientific study relate to philosophy and the humanities? This episode is about how to achieve happiness. It's arguably the most important one because it's the most practical episode in this series. Although, of course, it's grounded in these crucial theoretical understandings that we explore throughout this whole podcast. And the next episode is specifically about achieving meaning in life. Now, as I potentially implicitly hinted at earlier, each episode in this series can be appreciated and enjoyed by itself. But I think that the optimal experience of this series, I think you gain the most out of this podcast when you watch them all in order, because I've designed it to feel like a journey. I want it to feel like I'm guiding you through this massive, complex topic that is happiness, and we're going through it in a structured, fluid way. But of course, you don't need to watch the other episodes to understand this one, even though it helps. Now, this episode is, as I mentioned, about achieving happiness. It's about integrating all of the scientific research and philosophic underpinnings of all the information on happiness in our own mind, and we're generating this grand formula on how to actually be happy. What is it that human beings require in their lives to actually be happy? And in this, we're also going to be looking at the role of genetics and nature versus nurture in the acquisition of happiness. So, what do we actually need in our lives? How should we be setting up our lives to try and achieve happiness? This is perhaps the grand, most important practical question of this entire series. Now, there's lots of different models. There's lots of different theories on what we need. We've kind of explored some of these earlier. For example, last episode, we looked at the PERMA model forwarded by Martin Seligman as a means of achieving happiness, or what are the kind of factors that underpin happiness. But this PERMA model doesn't encompass the full side of the story. And that PERMA model, the P in the PERMA stands, for example, for positive emotions. It's a little bit tautological that positive emotions is going to be one of the key underpinnings for happiness. And of course, in the context of the PERMA model, that makes sense. But what I want to do is synthesize all these different models, all these different theories, to create this grand acronym on what actually generates happiness. What do human beings need to do it? Now, this can be expressed by the formula, or the acronym rather, SOLARSE. SOLARSE. And when I say that this is the formula for happiness, I really mean subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is this concept in positive psychology, and positive psychology is the field of psychological study dedicated to the realizing of happiness. And subjective well-being is what when we use happiness in the title of this podcast, it's what I mean colloquially, or really what most people mean colloquially when they refer to happiness. Subjective well-being has 3 components. One of these is hedonic well-being. It's the actual emotions that we feel on a day-to-day basis. When we live our lives, are we experiencing positive emotions like joy, awe, wonder, connection, trust, intimacy? Or are we feeling negative emotions like envy, sadness, fear, anger? And the balance of the emotions, i.e. the pleasure or pain that we feel, contributes hedonic well-being. Another component of this subjective well-being is called evaluative well-being, and it can kind of be understood as life satisfaction. And it consists essentially in gratification. And gratification isn't the same as pleasure, despite how it may be used colloquially. Gratification is stuff like learning new skills, teaching a child, reading a great book, engaging in a great discussion, running a marathon, engaging in activities that absorb us and utilize our skills and our character strengths and which build on those skills and strengths. An evaluative well-being, or rather the pursuit of gratification, may not be pleasurable in the moment. For example, training for a marathon may not be pleasurable in the moment. It may in fact be deeply displeasurable. But the point is that when we look back on our lives, it's this satisfaction with our lives. It's this sense of living a rich and full life that is well lived. The other component to subjective well-being is called eudaimonic well-being, and it essentially refers to meaning. Do we have a sense of purpose in our lives? Do we have goals? Are we able to pursue those goals? Do we have a sense of wandering around life, living from one day to another without any real meaning or purpose in life? Or do we have a sense that we have a future and we have things to do and we have things greater than ourselves to be a part of, and that we can exceed the boundaries of living day to day in order to be part of or to feel as if we are a part of some greater purpose or greater goal that transcends our immediate needs. Now, these three kinds of subjective well-being, hedonic well-being, evaluative well-being, and eudaimonic well-being, are all incorporated in this acronym that I've generated as a synthesis of all the available research on happiness. And this formula is generated as a product of years of research and literally hundreds of books on reading on different kinds of psychology and other social sciences, regular sciences, and the humanities. And I'm not bringing that up, as I mentioned in the first episode, for purposes of self-aggrandizement, but rather to lend credibility. I'm not approaching this as someone forwarding a theory. I'm approaching this as someone synthesizing all the theories that I've encountered to generate this acronym. SOLARSE stands for security, outlook, lifestyle, autonomy, relations, self-relation, and engagement and meaning. Let's explore what each of these letters kind of means. The S stands for security. Now, the security stands for our physical needs, such as food, shelter, warmth, air, water. It also stands for our personal health, also our personal security. We need to be free. We need to be safe. We need to be free from arbitrary loss of health or arbitrary violence or arbitrary loss of our possessions. And to this end, security also involves financial and material security. We need to know that we have the physical, material resources available to us to meet our needs. Now, a lot of people are aware of one paradigm of happiness, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's something that we've referenced a lot throughout this series, and it's represented as this pyramid of ascending tiers of human needs required for happiness. And what correlates to security are Maslow's conception of physiological needs, which are these biological requirements for human survival, and also safety needs. The idea of having some kind of order, predictability, and control in one's individual lives. Now, Maslow cited a physiological need as sex, which raises the question, is sex necessary for happiness? Now, this is obviously quite a sensitive question, but the research does not indicate that you need to be having sex with people in order to be happy. The way in which Maslow intended that was rather that if you have a build-up of sexual emotion, which can be released by masturbation, for example, rather than sex with other people, that can often lead to unhappiness. Colloquially, the idea of being pent up refers to this state. It's difficult to experience a state of happiness if we're experiencing physical discomfort, such as unrequited states of sexual energy buildup. Freud talked about this buildup of sexual energy a lot. The key thing here is that sex with another person is not necessary for happiness. The idea is just that this sexual energy should be discharged in some way, for example, by masturbation or a concomitant orgasm, or, for example, as Freud argued, by the process of sublimation, which is turning that sexual energy to something more productive. There's also various movements that are occurring now in modern society, such as the NoFap movement, which is this movement which eschews masturbation and states that happiness can be achieved not just in the absence of release of sexual energy, but because of that absence of release of sexual energy. This is not to say that the NoFap movement is scientifically accurate. It is just to say, however, that the idea of the build-up of sexual energy and the release of that energy being a physiological need can be need can be gratified in masturbatory processes, and it's not something that requires regular sex for, despite what may be thought of at first glance when looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, another tier on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which corresponds to the security level of this formula, is safety needs. The idea of being secure in some way, both in terms of society and financially. People need to be secure from arbitrary arrest, for example. They need to be secure from crime in some way. They need to be able to have possessions and be secure in that. So, for example, safety needs can be fulfilled by society in the form of a police force, schools, businesses, medical care, and law courts. This, of course, has political ramifications, and we're not going to be exploring the political ramifications of the human need for safety extensively here, but it is also worth noting that financial and material security is essential to some degree for human happiness. People living check to check, or people not knowing where their next paycheck is coming from, and people not knowing that they're not going to have enough material resources for survival or for the fulfillment of their emotional needs, that is obviously a major source of unhappiness. Unemployment, for example, has persistently shown to be a massive detriment in happiness. And there are political ramifications of this. For example, the political/economic philosophy of Keynesianism maintains that the goal of a government primarily should be to minimize unemployment as much as possible. The idea of Keynesianism is no longer dominant in how many Western societies, or at least the UK and the USA, conduct governance. A new economic philosophy since the 70s called neoliberalism has emerged, which tends to pay more attention to the minimization of inflation rather than employment. Although it has been shown that unemployment is one of the most psychologically or the most hedonically damaging things that can occur to an individual. I talk about Keynesianism and neoliberalism and the various political ramifications of the human desire for financial and material security on my regular podcast Polymath in the forms of discussing political ideologies, but it's not really relevant to here. A point is that security, material, physical security, is an important component of happiness. But what's equally important is that it is not the be-all and end-all to happiness. It is just one component of happiness. This is to say that money does not buy happiness, because happiness necessarily encompasses a huge range of factors that aren't just material. They're also social and emotional. However, a lack of physical resources can lead to a deficit in happiness. The O in the SOLARSE acronym stands for outlook, and it generally refers to having a positive perspective in life and a good outlook for happiness. It's about how we cognitively, to use the rider and elephant model forwarded in episode 1 of the season, it is how the rider chooses to cognitively handle and view the difficulties and the hardships that are inherent in life. Now, some examples of having a positive outlook I'm going to give now. I actually gave a talk in my first year of uni to the sort of student body about changing your personal philosophy, changing your outlook in order to be more conducive to happiness. And some examples of this are, for example, forgiving your own mistakes, striving to be better, however, complimenting yourself, treating yourself with compassion, comparing yourself to yourself and holding yourself to your own standards, recognizing that it's impossible to compare yourself to other people because their circumstances will be wildly different, trying to focus on the moment and not to ruminate on the past and the past mistakes, to simply gain what lessons you can from past mistakes and forgive yourself for making them, being friendly and polite and conducting yourself in a benevolent way, recognizing that you can't understand other people fully and that trying to understand someone's motivations and desires is helpful to a point, but is often easy to ruminate on, and also to understand that most people don't do the wrong thing intentionally, and it's important not to mistake ignorance, i.e. people doing the wrong thing, for malice, i.e. people deliberately doing the wrong thing. For example, most of the time when someone annoys you, they either don't know it, didn't mean the stimulus to be that way, or it was misinterpreted by yourself. It's also important to try and see other people's sides and disagreements and avoid picking grudges. Don't bottle up emotions, but confront people properly in private, in a non-argumentative or non-judgmental fashion, avoiding generating resentment in others, acknowledging your emotions and trying not to suppress them, and accepting that which you can't control, and basing your happiness on only the things that you can control and only your cognitive processes. These are all examples of outlook that are beneficial for happiness. Another quite important concept in the idea of outlook is cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal is the idea that you reinterpret a hardship that happens to you in life in a way that lessens the emotional impact of it. For example, let's say you go to work and your boss starts yelling at you. You could interpret this stimulus to mean that you are stupid or incompetent or you deserve to be yelled at in some way, or you could interpret that as your boss was just having a bad day and it's unrelated to your own conduct. This idea of cognitive reappraisal has been discussed in the sciences and in philosophy at length. An example of philosophy is this Roman philosopher called Boethius, who was existing in the 6th century AD. Boethius was imprisoned and sentenced to death, and classically wrote a book about it. Essentially writing a book where he was visited by the personification of philosophy, Lady Philosophy, who basically told him to reframe his outlook, to reframe his perspective on the situation in a way that reduced his emotional impact from it. For example, Lady Philosophy reminds Boethius that life is full of chance and anarchy, and that there's lots of fleeting events and lots of random happenstances that are inherent in life, and that suffering and hardship are inherent in life. The fact is, the same you, or Boethius in this case, but really for anyone, may be deeply fortunate and have lots of material success in one moment, and may be deeply unfortunate and experience lots of suffering and hardship in the next. The key is to take all of these things in equanimity and to be grateful for the good things that one previously experienced in life. And also to understand that ultimately, the trials and tribulations of individuals faced with the cosmic vastness of the world are insignificant, and to try and broaden his perspective, and to admit that riches and fame and other material successes that he previously enjoyed didn't actually bring him lasting happiness, but rather just brought on greed and anxiety at losing these things. This is actually quite similar to the Buddhist concept of attachment, which is by having material or social gains, for example, wealth or riches or a strong relationship or autonomy or freedom, all of these things which we may feel attached to are actually potential sources of suffering because we can lose them at a moment's notice. And the key to escape this attachment to external things that we may lose at a moment's notice due to the random changes of life and of fortune is to promote a kind of detachment from these things and to promote a kind of mental equanimity wherein what determines your happiness is your own internal state rather than your external environment. The philosophy of Stoicism said something similar, in that our happiness shouldn't be dependent on our external environment, but rather should be based on only that which we can directly control, i.e. how we interpret the hardships how we interpret the hardships and the tribulations of our external environment and how we choose to deal with them. Now, the idea of cognitive reappraisal, which, as I mentioned, has reoccurred in Western and Eastern philosophy multiple times, is also really strongly integrated in modern sciences. Lots of different modalities of therapy, and I've mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy as a key example of this, utilize the idea of cognitive reappraisal, of reshaping your reactions to certain things. And by saying that even though we may experience hardships and we can't control our emotional reactions to them, we can at least change our thought process behind them, wherein, for example, let's say someone annoys us, we may feel angry, but we can tell ourselves that they don't mean to be annoying and that we should forgive them. And over time, because the brain is plastic, i.e. it can change itself and shapes itself in accordance to the internal and external stimuli that we put upon it, over time, our emotional responses to these things becomes lesser. Now, outlook is also all about adaptive thought patterns, about regulating your emotions in the right way and seeking not to suppress or struggle against them, but to instead welcome and acknowledge them, and not try and struggle against them, but acknowledge that they may be incorrect. This, by the way, is kind of the idea that different people handle and process their emotions in different ways is encapsulated by the concept of affective style, which we'll be getting onto later in this episode, and is an important determinant towards happiness. Social media, another thing, can often be quite damaging to the outlook side of things because social media gives an irresistible tendency to compare oneself to others, particularly others who are famous on social media because they represent a massive, for any kind of trait, for example, physical beauty, everyone is going to vary on a kind of bell curve, and most people will be middling in the scale of physical beauty. Some people will be very physically beautiful. Some people will be very physically unbeautiful. In social media, you tend to just see those very few people who identify the superlative aspect of a given trait. And then the problem is, because we're seeing all these people, we tend to compare themselves to them. Hence, social media can have really damaging effects towards our perception of ourselves because we're comparing ourselves to a standard which isn't a standard at all. It represents an exceptional, anomalous level. Also, lots of images on, just to further the metaphor of the example, of physical beauty, lots of images on social media are edited. In fact, the vast majority of them. And that's just an example, but it shows that how social media, or indeed any kind of norms in mainstream media, for example, film and TV, can distort our expectations of what's normal and therefore distort our self-image. Finally, in terms of outlook, what's important is having a general zest for life. And the idea of a zest for life might sound a bit silly, but it is a recognizable psychological term. And the idea of a zest for life is a sort of general enthusiasm for life, treating life as an adventure, treating it with a sense of whimsy, a sense of interest, a desire to engage with it, not just out of necessity, but out of enjoyment. And that is an important part of outlook. Curiosity, hope, and humor, all of these things are important parts of outlook. And in episode 3, we discussed character strengths and character virtues. And an important aspect of character strengths and character virtues, these things, these aspects of someone's character which tend towards happiness, are indeed this idea of whimsy and zest and curiosity and hope and humor and a genuine interest in things and an appreciation of the beauty of the world and an appreciation of the beauty of nature and a general feeling of benevolence towards fellow people and the propensity to forgive people and tolerate people and love others. All of these things are stuff that is cultivated cognitively by the self. People do have varying degrees of these things naturally, i.e. the elephant in the rider or elephant model will exhibit these personality traits to different degrees in people, but positive personality traits can be consciously cultivated by the rider. Or to return to another analogy in episode 1 of this podcast, System 2 of thought can consciously choose to cultivate an attitude of zest, curiosity, hope, and humor, until over time it becomes part of our System 1 of thought, i.e. our basic orientation. Now, the L in this SOLARSE acronym stands for lifestyle, and it encompasses things like sleep, diet, exercise, nature, a work-life balance, hobbies, even medications. Let's go through all of these in turn. Sleep is a very important aspect of lifestyle, and there's a huge wealth in literature of the basics of, or the kind of relation of sleep to happiness, and also the importance of sleep in general and how good sleep hygiene can be attained. But it's just important to bring up in this podcast in that sleep is an essential component of mental health. It affects the elephant in all kinds of ways, and it will also affect the rider in all kinds of ways due to that the link between the rider and the elephant. Having a healthy diet, a really important aspect of lifestyle as well. And we talk about diet a little bit in episode 1, but the key thing with diet is I really recommend looking up some information, for example, from the NHS on good diet, and particularly to buy a book called The Way to Eat, which is this great nutritional handbook. I'd also think it's really important to be wary of anything marketing itself as alternative nutrition. Because alternative nutrition, there are different nutritional theories, often developed by people who are trying to sell you supplements. For example, Patrick Holborn, and his company of Optimum Nutrition and his handbook. Patrick Holborn published this textbook about, let me just find it. It's Patrick Holfoot, and the book is called The Optimum Nutrition Bible. There's just lots of different forms of alternative nutrition, which market themselves as scientific because they may be based on 1 or 2 studies. But then it's very easy to dig up a study supporting your point of view because lots of scientific studies are biased or poorly handled or lead to misleading conclusions. And the key thing with mainstream nutrition is that it's based on a scientific consensus, wherein a scientific theory has been repeatedly tested and retested to hammer out the details and to hammer out what's right. Again, with lifestyle, regular exercise, so important. Oh, by the way, I'm using Patrick Holford as an example because I've personally read the Optimum Nutrition Bible, but there's plenty of fad diets such as detox diets. There's plenty of fad nutritional theories, and it's really, really important to be skeptical. Again, there's this online database online called PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D, and it's this database of peer-reviewed scientific papers. And if you ever have any questions on diet or for the use of dietary supplements, I would strongly advise looking on PubMed rather than just Googling stuff online, because anything can be online. Anyone can publish any form of health information. The key thing is to get scientific information from a reliable source. Anyway, back to exercise. Exercise, again, regular exercise in any form, and it can be aerobic or anaerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise being what we might call cardio, could be walking, running, jogging, etc. And anaerobic exercise being a form of exercise that taxes the muscles, for example, weightlifting. Regular exercise in any kind of form is just so important, and there's such a wealth of research on the impacts that exercise can have on the brain, both psychological and physiological. It really is the closest thing we have to a panacea, i.e. a universal cure for disease. Exercise is recommended as a therapy for so many different kinds of pathologies and diseases, and it's so useful in maintaining good psychiatric health that it just has to be mentioned as part of lifestyle. Even just walking to work if you can rather than taking the bus, or just getting off a stop early and then walking or jogging to work, it does make a genuine difference. Some other aspects of lifestyle, regular exposure to nature. Some scientists see this as so important that they'd put exposure to nature as a letter in that acronym that I've given, SOLARSE, in its own right. Having a work-life balance in some way, also really important. Doing hobbies, doing fun things that increase your hedonic well-being, but also balancing that with work. So doing pleasurable activities and hobbies, but not just meaningly chasing hedonistic activities, but balancing that with a meaningful form of work, so that increases both your hedonic and evaluative well-being. And especially doing things that give you a sense of mastery, a sense of self-confidence and ability. For example, successfully completing a task. For example, climbing a mountain, or running a half marathon, or doing a bike race, or even just going to the gym and completing a set of exercises. The idea of achieving accomplishments and having regular accomplishments is an important aspect of lifestyle. Balance in lifestyle is important. Now, the A in the acronym SOLARSE stands for autonomy, and it basically means a sense of control on an agency over your own life. This belief in your ability that you have resources at your disposal, to use as a term grounded in salutogenic theories we explored in episode 3, but the idea that you have social and emotional resources and that you have the ability to use these resources properly. The idea that you are in control of your own life's trajectory, and also that your opinions and your beliefs in the direction of your own life is independent of social pressures and the judgments of other people or of society at large. Autonomy is the exercise of your own judgment and will. And of course, autonomy has a political component because different societies prescribe different limits to your autonomy. An important concept in autonomy is not that you can do whatever you want, for example, steal things and kill people, but just that you have the ability to genuinely control the trajectory of your life. Now, again, this has political implications. For the vast majority of human civilization, dating back from 4000 BC, the aim of government was not to allow its individuals to be happy and autonomous. In fact, the vast majority of human societies not only kept slaves, but did not see a moral transgression in doing so. But the idea of society was not to provide the minimum number of laws necessary to regulate human conduct and allow people to do whatever they wanted within this basic framework. It was to regulate people's lives and to subordinate the fulfillment of individuals to the glory and the prestige of the nation or of the royal family as a whole. The idea that society existed as a vehicle to provide human beings with enough security and material safety as they needed to pursue lives in the direction that they wanted to dates to the philosophy of liberalism emerging in the 1700s in Europe. More information on this in the other podcast that I run, Polymath, but I'm just mentioning this as a kind of aside. The R in SOLARSE stands for relations. Human beings are social animals. The number and depth of social relations is very, very important. Social acceptance, the feeling of being part of a group and being accepted as part of a group by other people, is really important for our happiness. Also a sense of social harmony. The idea that you are in a group and that group generally gets along with each other, supports each other, and is there for each other. All of this sounds quite self-evident, but it is just really, really important. Social exclusion and social rejection are painful. In fact, social and emotional pain are processed in the same way as our brain, in the same way that physical pain is. It's just a testament to the importance of sociality in human happiness. Social status is also an important part of happiness as well, i.e. how we are perceived by others. This, by the way, is why a practically universal human concern is how we are perceived by others, particularly seen in men due to the actions of testosterone, because testosterone is a competition hormone which provides a behavioral motivation for increasing social status. But the concern with social status and reputation is universal throughout human beings. The desire to avoid humiliation and the drastic emotional impacts that humiliation or subjugation or kind of lack of respect, the importance of that in human culture and human psychology is a testament to the importance of social happiness and esteem of others in happiness in general. Another aspect of relations: empathy, intimacy, and affection, and the reciprocal exchange of empathy, intimacy, and affection between the individual and someone else, really important to our happiness. Love, acceptance, trust. All of these are not just abstract ideals, but have physical, neurological correlates. For example, the release of oxytocin, which we explore a little bit in the first episode of this podcast. All of this stuff is so important. We've evolved as human beings to respond to sociality. Morality is a part of this. Helping other people is also something which humans tend to find intrinsically valuable and beneficial to human happiness. So, the other S in this acronym SOLARSE is self-relation. How do we perceive ourselves? First of all, knowledge of ourselves is very important. Knowledge of finding meaning in life, not finding meaning in life. An important part of meaning in life is the idea of knowing yourself. And of course, there is the famous quote found at the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece that is, know thyself. Some kind of self-knowledge and self-perception is important for happiness, but more than that, self-acceptance. We have to accept who we are. And that doesn't mean not striving to change or improve ourselves in some way. It just means if you look at the mirror and you hate yourself, you're obviously not going to be happy. Self-esteem and self-confidence, and also self-efficacy, the idea that you can do the things that you set out to do, really, really important for happiness. Also in self-relation, the idea of self-development and self-discovery. The idea not only of knowing yourself and finding yourself, but also of actively seeking to improve yourself, on working on your character strengths and virtues, as elaborated on in episode 3 of this podcast, and seeking to cultivate yourself. And the idea of self-cultivation, as I mentioned in episode 2 of this podcast, is widely talked about by loads of different philosophies, including Buddhism, Taoism, not just Eastern philosophies, but Western philosophies as well, Judeo-Christian interpretations of happiness and different teachings, Native American philosophies and the use of entheogens as psychoactive agents, as things that allow spiritual development and self-discovery. All of these things are really important for happiness. The idea that we are not a static being, but that we are growing and changing. This, by the way, relates to a quality that we see in Maslow's hierarchy of needs called self-actualization. And self-actualization is this realization of all that you can be. It is of flourishing. It is of becoming the best possible version of yourself. And that is a self-oriented process. The idea of discovering your own interests, of nurturing a positive attitude towards yourself and also of other people, of accomplishing things, building on your skills and acquiring new skills. All of this is a key part of self-actualization and of the process of developing a sense of mastery. A sense of mastery is a psychological term which doesn't mean you are the greatest person alive and that you are a genius, but that you can do things and you can do things well. All of this is a really important part of how we engage with ourselves. Speaking of engagement, the E in SOLARSE, the final letter of this acronym, stands for engagement and meaning. What does that mean? It means, first of all, having this sense of zest and active engagement in life and this sense of whimsy and trying to seize carpe diem, as the classic Latin phrase goes, so trying to seize the day and trying to seize control of your life. But it also means engaging in activities that induce a state of flow. We've talked about flow state in the last episode of this podcast, but it's essentially when you're engaged in activity and you're fully engaged in that activity. You are fully absorbed in doing what you are doing. Time seems to fly past. And this is an inherently enjoyable and gratifying thing. And the frequent experience of flow state and the ability to find things that bring on a flow state is really important in happiness. And engaging in activities that develop our character strengths and virtues, as discussed in episode 3 of this podcast, engaging in activities that bring some kinds of skill is really important. It's an engagement. So when I say engagement and meaning, I mean engagement not just with yourself and understanding yourself, but also in life and in activities and in the doing of things. Having a zest for life and an appreciation of beauty, really big thing in engagement and meaning. Gratitude, massive part of engagement and meaning. Gratitude, by the way, so in positive psychology, often the things which positive psychologists do, the things which they test out that make people happier are called positive psychology interventions. And some form of gratitude journaling or on reflecting on the things that you've done right or things that have gone right in your life is a really important part of positive psychology interventions. Hope, another key aspect of engagement and meaning. And of course, hope is something that may be difficult to acquire in a life beset by hardship, but that is where, as talked about in episode 3, the second wave of positive psychology comes in, or existential positive psychology. Existential positive psychology is all about conceptualizing suffering not as this wholly negative aspect of hardship, but something that we can learn from and that we can use to understand ourselves and also that inspires us to connect with other people. Suffering can be a process that allows us to transcend ourselves. And this idea of self-transcendence, I've talked about a lot on this podcast. I'll be talking about a lot next episode especially. But what that essentially means in this case is that something that can be something that broadens our perspective. It's something that can help us relate to other people. It's something that we can utilize in understanding ourselves better but also in, for example, pursuing a greater sense of meaning. For example, the National Association for Unexpected Child Death was founded by parents who have lost children suddenly in their crib. The idea is that the suffering experienced by those parents was channeled in a way of creating something else and of creating some larger purpose to dedicate one's life to, which can be beneficial. The whole point is that suffering is an important part of engagement and meaning. And the idea that suffering is an important part of life is actually encapsulated by the Buddhist principle of dukkha. D-U-K-K-H-A. Dukkha just means suffering. And it is one of the 4 noble truths, i.e. one of the 4 core postulates of the Buddhist philosophy, that suffering is an inherent part of life. Engagement and meaning also means an active involvement in pursuing your own goals and kind of engaging with your environment. It means trying to find an intrinsic sense of purpose. What does that mean? When it comes to meaning, there is a distinction that needs to be made in the humanities between meaning of life and meaning in life. Meaning of life is a generalized philosophical concept. It's been speculated on by a myriad of philosophers, for example, Kierkegaard, Camus, Nietzsche, lots of different figures. Meaning in life is an individual question. It is an answer to the questions, who am I and what am I here for, that you generate for yourself. And of course, the experience of purpose and meaning in life, we're going to be talking about this more in the next episode, but it's really important in positive emotion and is involved in that idea which we refer to as eudaimonic well-being. Having a purpose in life, having a direction of one's energy, having a driving force in your actions, having a long-term goal and motivation is really, really important. And finding a meaning in life is a subjective and a unique process. It takes place in your mind as an individual. It is an answer. It is a thing that you fabricate for yourself. It cannot be dictated to you. It cannot be given to you as a gift. It's something that people realize, to use the rider and elephant metaphor, it is something that the rider constructs for oneself and which the elephant deeply kind of inherently feels. Now, the idea of a universal meaning of life is kind of supplied by lots of different philosophies and belief systems, but there is a philosophy called positive nihilism, which is basically that there is no inherent meaning in life, but that is not necessarily a bad thing, and that it allows us as individuals to to create our own meanings in life. The idea is that the absence of a set existential purpose in life that applies to all human beings is not a bad thing, because it gives you as an individual the autonomy to find your own sense of meaning, and it gives that meaning a sense of existential legitimacy. Now, there is a psychologist called Viktor Frankl. He was a concentration camp in the Holocaust concentration camp survivor, and he wrote a very famous book called Man's Search for Meaning. Now, Viktor Frankl outlined 3 different sources of meaning. One is performing good deeds and actions, i.e. to give or contribute something good or useful. By the way, a persistent theme in this podcast is that morality is very important for happiness. And this is supported not only by its repeated recurrence in lots of different philosophies around the world, but also by scientific research. Anyway, continuing what Frankl said, or by one's creativity to create something beautiful. Again, creativity and the use of one's creativity, an important source of happiness. 2, according to Viktor Frankl's criteria, experience something valuable, beautiful, experiencing goodness and loving fellowship. This is similar to a concept introduced by Abraham Maslow called peak experiences, which are these rare kind of vast, oceanic, spiritual experiences that we may experience in life, which change our understandings of ourselves and the world around them. And peak experiences can be religious experiences. They can also just be something like going to a concert and feeling really, really one with everyone. It can be something like taking psychedelics and experiencing a psychoactive spiritual experience. It can be found in sharing deep, meaningful loved ones with friends and family. It can be found in pursuing something like extreme sports. The idea is that peak experiences are these experiences of something deeply valuable and beautiful, which help guide us in life and give us a sense of meaning and orientation. Now anyway, Viktor Frankl's third source of meaning, as outlined, is realizing dignified, honorable, and positive attitudes in the face of life's challenges, such as illness, suffering, and death. I.e., meaning can be found in suffering, which is what existential positive psychology often says. Now, self-transcendence is an idea that's quite similar to meaning, and we'll be exploring self-transcendence a bit in the next episode. But the idea behind self-transcendence is that it is the ability to transcend oneself. It is about opening up to something greater than just your immediate needs. It can be about doing a particular job and getting lost in your work. It can be about pursuing some kind of effort, or for example, founding or being part of some kind of organization or association or society. It can be about getting involved in civic virtue and civic life, pursuing virtue in one's own life. It's essentially the idea of getting involved in something larger than yourself. And that religion, by the way, is a classic example of this. And that this is a really important source of meaning in one's life. Meaning in life also comes from being open to the kindness and the love of other people. Social support has been proven to be really closely related to individuals' perception of meaning. Now, in the absence of a sense of meaning in life, when the will to meaning of an individual is frustrated or disappointed or unfulfilled, Viktor Frankl calls this state existential frustration or an existential vacuum. And it often leads to a sense of real despair. When people feel as if they don't have a meaning in life, i.e. that there's no reason to live life and that life is not worth living, this is classically a very negative state of mind. This is not fun. And the key thing to understand here is that this is not really a mental illness per se. It can manifest as depression, but it's not in itself depression. What it really is, according to Viktor Frankl, is a form of spiritual distress. And the use of the word spiritual is important here because this podcast is about science and the humanities, and the word spiritual seems to suggest a humanities-based approach. But spirituality is a scientific psychological concept as well. The idea of spiritual distress, the idea of having meaning in one's life, is not just a philosophical concept, it's a scientific concept as well. So, this formula for happiness, this acronym of SOLARSE, security, outlook, lifestyle, autonomy, relations, self-relation, engagement, and meaning. Now, there is, of course, something important to say, and that there's the role of individual differences. You've probably noticed at life that different people have different dispositions and temperaments and personalities. Different people seem to have different basic levels of happiness. They'll have different basic emotional orientations to the world. And obviously this can be changed. I mean, people going through negative events or positive events or really dark times at life or really good times in life, this will obviously change them. But the idea is that there is some kind of constant individual aspect in the way that people respond to situations emotionally. And of course, people have different personalities, different ways of dealing with things, different ways of regulating emotion. And this is, of course, due to someone's genes and to someone's environment. It is not the idea of nature versus nurture never makes any sense in any context it's applied in because it's always about both. What determines someone's level of emotional regulation, i.e. what determines someone's rider and their elephant, will be in part genetically determined, but it will also be in part determined by the environment of their lives and the conditions which they face. In fact, people's environments affect their genes through the process of epigenetics, which is basically where your body chooses to switch certain genes on or off, and therefore to enact the effects of certain genes based on the situation, based on the external environment that individuals find themselves in. Now, an important aspect of kind of individual differences in people's happiness is the idea of personality. Now, personality is something that everyone has a kind of rough awareness of, but when it comes to actually understanding personality, when it comes to scientifically measuring what personality is, this is much less well known. Now, a key concept in personality research is the idea of the Big Five, wherein if you take all the different personality traits that are recognized in lots of different languages and lots of different cultures, they can all kind of be grouped into 5 categories, and all the traits in each category kind of correlate with each other, so that one person who's more likely to be, for example, hardworking is also more likely to be thoughtful, for example. And these correlations kind of cluster into these 5 super clusters of great overarching traits. Now, the Big Five can be summarized in the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And it's worth talking about this study of personality because personality is genetically determined. Different studies say different things. Basically, the heritability of personality is estimated to be around 30 to 60%. The rest of it is determined by someone's environment, not just their genes. So personalities are malleable and they are variable, but there is a really strong genetic component to personality. Now, let's explore this kind of OCEAN acronym. Openness to experience is stuff like creativity, curiosity, openness to new ideas, openness to radical ideas or out-of-the-box thinking. It is zest, whimsy, aesthetic appreciation. C, conscientiousness is self-control, self-discipline, restraint, temperance, being hardworking, being orderly, being neat or tidy, being diligent. E, extroversion, refers to being sociable, outgoing, talkative, eager to pursue new ideas. It's also correlated with the idea of being an adrenaline junkie. Agreeableness is about being patient, kind, tolerant, friendly, calm, chill, to use a colloquial term. And N is neuroticism. Neuroticism is people who rank high on neuroticism tend to be more stressed, less emotionally stable, less insecure, more worried about things, etc., etc. As we can imagine, the personality trait of neuroticism plays a big part in happiness, but also these other personality traits play a big role in happiness as well because of how they relate to SOLARSE. Openness to experience, higher openness to experience, we can imagine would be conducive to greater happiness because zest and whimsy and open-mindedness and the ability to kind of broaden one's mind and it broaden one's horizons is all conducive to self-transcendence and the search for meaning. Also, openness to experience directly encompasses things like zest and whimsy, which we know are directly related to happiness. Conscientiousness is also important in happiness because it helps achieving goals and working on skills. I mean, there's that classic adage that genius is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. The experience of accomplishment and mastery and gaining new skills and developing our strengths is pleasurable to human beings, but it requires lots of effort, and that in itself requires self-discipline. Self-discipline is also correlated with success in life by lots of different measures, more so, in fact, than someone's IQ. Extroversion and agreeableness, important in happiness because they all kind of pertain to social relations and the ease at which an individual is able to both form and maintain these social connections. Agreeableness especially is important in happiness because being kind and patient and tolerant and genuinely decent and civil are really important in gaining social acceptance, also gaining social status, although extroversion is also important in social status, and for maintaining social harmony. And of course, neuroticism kind of directly related to happiness. There's also a concept in psychology called someone's affective style. Now, the affective style of an individual it's this kind of umbrella term, which basically talks about not just personality and like basic emotional stances that individuals have, but also people's ability to regulate their own emotions. Under the umbrella, under this rubric of affective style is, for example, the threshold required for people to feel certain emotions like anger or disgust or sadness or happiness, the time taken for people to recover from negative emotions, both physiologically and psychologically, the regulatory stance that people have towards their emotions. For example, do they have a concealing affective style and attempt to suppress their emotions? Do they have an adjusting affective style where they're able to control their emotions well and kind of modify or adjust or switch between their emotional responses, and they know what to do to improve their mood? Or do they have a tolerating affective style where people can deal with having their emotions and just accept them, and then it's okay if other people see someone experiencing strong emotions, that they don't perceive that there's anything wrong in feeling strong emotions? The idea of affective style, therefore, has lots of different kind of components. The idea of how quickly it takes for people's emotional response to stimuli to both peak and to kind of recover from that emotional response is encompassed in the term affective chronometry, which is the kind of temporal or time-based dynamics of affective responding. The word affect, by the way, refers to someone's basic emotional state. Affect is a psychological term. Technically, an affect is an emotional state consisting of two dimensions, one of which is valence, the other one is arousal. Valence refers to the inherent pleasurability of an emotional state. For example, calmness and happiness, ecstasy and joy have a positive emotional valence. Sadness and anger have a negative emotional valence. Arousal refers to physiological arousal, i.e., is it the kind of emotion where you feel high levels of alertness and perhaps sympathetic nervous system activation, for example, ecstasy or anger, or is it the opposite, for example, calmness or sadness? Now, affective style varies to quite a large degree between different individuals, and although, of course, it can be consciously changed. People are not locked into their individual genetic differences, but there is a genetic individual component to the variation of affective style. A lot of what the biological grounding of the affective style comes down to what we talked about in episode 1 about our brain's motivation and reward system, and how our motivation system in our brain has both an approach and a withdrawal opponent. Our motivation system mediates both approaching emotions, for example, happiness, curiosity, excitement, enthusiasm, and negative withdrawal emotions, for example, fear and disgust. The approach system of our motivation doesn't necessarily always involve positive affective states. For example, it can include anger, which often gets us to approach a stimulus and deal with it. But the idea is that our motivational system has receptors which mediate pursuing impulses and receptors which mediate aversive impulses, i.e., our motivational system controls both our propensity to want to kind of experience positive approach-based emotions and negative withdrawal-based emotions. And there's quite a lot of individual differences in in the kind of relative emphasis of people's motivational systems. An example of this which we can find is a kind of difference in relative activation of the left or the right prefrontal cortex. So if you study the brainwaves of certain individuals, and proportionally they tend to have more electrical activity in their left prefrontal cortex than their right prefrontal cortex, that is correlated with a more positive motivational style and more positive emotions and more of a positive affective style. Conversely, people with more of a certain type of brainwave coming from the right prefrontal cortex tend to have more withdrawal-based motivational systems and tend to experience more negative affective styles and more negative emotions. So this asymmetric prefrontal activation is noted, by the way, in infants, and that infants with a certain emphasis on one side of the prefrontal cortex activation. By the way, just a bit of anatomy to explain. When we talk about the prefrontal cortex, what we mean is there's actually two prefrontal cortices. There's a left and a right, because the brain is organized into two cerebral hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. There's lots of myths about the idea of a left-right paired brain. For example, that artists have more of an emphasis on one side of the brain and scientists have more of an emphasis on the other side of the brain, and that's untrue. But it is true that different sides of the brain, to a limited extent, are more specialized for certain other functions. That's only valid for a few functions, but there are still some actual differences in each side of the brain. An example which we can see here is the idea of the left prefrontal cortex / right prefrontal cortex activation, and how the asymmetric prefrontal activation has a genuine correlation with how people tend to feel and their happiness levels, and that this is genetically based to at least to a significant extent. Now, it's actually been shown by lots of studies, and in fact the studies which tended to establish this fact were conducted by Licken and Tellegen, these two researchers in 1996, who followed over 1,000 sets of twins for 10 years, and they concluded that around 50% of our happiness levels are determined by genetics. And that also other researchers such as Heady and Waring in 1989 suggest that our position on the spectrum of these stable personality traits, these big 5 personality traits that we mentioned earlier, accounts for how we experience and how we perceive life events, and therefore plays another really big part in our levels of happiness. Now, again, this doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do about our level of happiness. Far from it. And we're going to talk more about that in a bit. But it is still just worth talking about right now, just to establish a good theoretical understanding of the kind of role of genes and the level of happiness. And in fact, we even know of a gene in mice called PDE4B. And this gene PDE4B, which is also present in humans, by the way, codes for this enzyme called phosphodiesterase 4B. PDE4B stands for phosphodiesterase 4B. And when genes in mice were altered to inhibit the activity of this gene, and therefore the activity of this enzyme, these PDE4B inhibited mice showed enhanced cognitive abilities. They had a more effective memory. They also show less anxiety. They show less fear. They also have a diminished memory of fear, which is very important. And for example, they showed a decreased fear response to cat urine. And also suggesting that potentially an effect of inhibiting this gene could be an increase in risk-taking behavior. Also, human beings have this gene, and there is research going on to develop drugs that will specifically inhibit this gene, and which could be used for psychopathologies, for example, or helping deal with PTSD. Now, it's worth noticing that the fact that the inhibition of PDE4B in mice inhibits the fear response to cats kind of indicates why fear responses exist in the first place. Fear is an adaptive mechanism to help us avoid things that are dangerous to us. It's just, I bring up this gene to just mention the fact that genes do play a role in how we feel and our happiness. In fact, there's lots of neurological features that play a role in our level of happiness. For example, the size and activity levels of our amygdala, also the size and the number of nerve cells in our hippocampus. And these things are to an extent genetically determined, but also what's really important, they're also really determined by our internal and external environment. For example, regular exercise has been shown to increase the number of cells in the hippocampus and to increase psychological resilience, more on resilience later, but also the meditation and mindfulness, which we're going to be talking about later as well, can also inhibit the activity of the amygdala and eventually cause a decrease in its size. What I'm trying to say is that we are talking about genes and inherent features at the moment, but it's important to keep in mind that people's environment play, the kind of SOLARSE formula that we talked about plays a massive role in happiness as well. A scientific theory that helps us integrate these complementary roles of genes and environment can be found in the idea of hedonic adaptation. What does this mean? Basically, human beings tend to have a set point of happiness. And that set point of happiness is this sort of baseline level of happiness that people tend to experience as a result of daily life. And that when they experience major events, either positive or negative, for example, a physical injury or winning the lottery, there may be a temporary deviation from this set point of happiness, but generally, their brains will tend to return to this baseline level of happiness. And this return to baseline levels of happiness is called hedonic adaptation. Now, the key thing is that this set point can be moved. It can be movable up and down based on the circumstances of your life. Hence the relevance of the formula SOLARSE, because all of these things are about changing our kind of happiness set point or our well-being set point. And also, actually, I'm just going to give some examples of this of the hedonic set point and the relevance of this. So there was this study conducted in 1978 by various researchers, the most predominant of which being Philip Brickman, where researchers interviewed 22 lottery winners and 29 paraplegics, and actually found that the Levels of happiness of the lottery winners shortly after winning the lottery were, as you can expect, highly elevated, but they eventually returned back to their baseline levels. Also, with the 29 paraplegics, although immediately after the accident that led to the development of their paraplegia, their levels of happiness were massively decreased, these levels gradually increased until at the time of interview, the paraplegics actually said that they generally felt more happy than unhappy. Now, the idea of resilience in psychology can be seen as the ability of a human being, the ability of the psyche to resist negative deviations away from the happiness set point as a response to negative life events. And there's lots of different components to resilience. The number of cells in the hippocampus I actually mentioned is one of them. And an increase in the number of cells in the hippocampus and the connectivity of all these cells to each other, i.e. neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. Neurogenesis is the development of new nerve cells. Neuroplasticity is the connectivity of all these cells to each other and the ability of the brain to remold itself. Both of these things are increased by a chemical called BDNF, which is increased by regular exercise and has been shown to play a really pivotal role in resilience. Now, other things. Some things in life can permanently change baseline levels of well-being. For example, having children or being married on average tends to increase people's happiness set point. But also having major lifetime events such as having a divorce, losing a spouse, for women losing their job and the birth of a child can cause a temporary large deviation away from that happiness set point, but it will eventually return to normal. However, marriage, i.e. being in a happy marriage, and also unemployment in men was shown to have a much more permanent role in changing the set point, and that hedonic adaptation didn't occur by itself, and that it required some kind of psychological intervention to do so. There was another study actually by Wilderman, Turney and Schnittke in 2014, which studied the effects of imprisonment on one's baseline level of well-being, and they found that being in prison reduced people's happiness set point, as could be expected, but being free again then led to the restoration of the normal happiness set point. The point that's important to make is that genes and environment are both involved in the set point. Environment, the kind of circumstance of one's life can shift that genetic set point, but also there is lots of individual differences caused by genes in where that set point tends to be at anyway. Now, the aim of positive psychology, or rather the aims, are to move that set point to a higher level using positive psychology interventions and increasing people's subjective well-being by both interventions and knowledge and understanding. Also, to increase resilience and for individuals to be as happy as they can be within genetic boundaries. Even individuals' tendencies towards optimism and pessimism, which are largely personality and genetically derived, are in fact malleable. Learned optimism is a thing and can be done by individuals. Cognitive reappraisal, as we talked about, both in the form of CBT and philosophical study, can also, over time, gradually change people's kind of dispositions and emotional tendencies and affective style, even though that takes a lot of time. And it's essentially a process of the rider exerting long-term effort to reshape, or rather to tame the elephant, and to shift positive beliefs and positive thought patterns and positive coping mechanisms from system 2 of thought, i.e. from deliberate, effortful practice, over the long term to system 1 of thought, i.e. automatic practice. And this works, of course, because of that key concept of neuroplasticity. The brain can remodel itself. The activity of the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex can be changed. We can also move upwards on the kind of spectrum of mental health, the salutogenic continuum or the mental health continuum, to use terms that we talked about in episode 3, by the process of mindfulness. Now, the word mindfulness was actually coined in 1881. An English scholar called Rhys Davids translated the Buddhist word sati, which itself meant memory, recollection, calling to mind, being aware of certain specified facts, into this kind of English word mindfulness. And mindfulness is this concept of essentially being in the moment. It is a mental state. Rather, mindfulness is the process that leads to a mental state characterized by non-judgmental awareness of the present moment experience, and also a non-judgmental awareness and acceptance of one's sensations, one's thoughts, the physiological states of one's body, for example, a high heart rate brought on by stress, one's own consciousness, and one's own environment. And it encourages fundamentally acceptance, or what we may call a tolerating affective style. And it also encourages openness and curiosity. And this stands in stark contrast with much of our common daily experience, which is just by doing things mindlessly, i.e. in a state of autopilot or non-attention. Mindfulness is all about bringing one's attention to the present moment and not trying to do any kind of cognitive reappraisal, not trying to structure or believe of it, but rather a conscious process of non-appraisal, of just allowing yourself to be. So mindfulness is both a practice, it's both something we do, and it's a skill. It's something that we can cultivate and work on. And there's a huge wealth of evidence, and there's a lot kind of talking about the benefits of mindfulness. Mindfulness activates the area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which we've been talking about throughout this entire podcast, and actually causes the prefrontal cortex to signal to the limbic system and just calm it down. I.e. by accessing this observing, detached, non-judgmental self, we can calm down our emotional reactions. Now, the first mindfulness-based interventions for happiness were developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn in 1977, and it actually consciously sought to integrate Buddhist insight and a Buddhist form of meditation called Vipassana meditation with other contemplative practices such as Zen and yoga, with modern psychological theories about stress and coping with stress, and about the neuroanatomy of stress. And indeed, an aim of mindfulness really is self-regulation. It's being able to regulate not just one's attention and behavior, but also one's emotions. And again, there's lots of different kinds of mindfulness-based kind of interventions that can be done. Meditation is a key example, which can be both with a trained teacher or a kind of daily audio-guided home practice, but there's lots of different examples. It can also be about different forms of mental imagery. For example, seeing your thought process as a conveyor belt, or a river, just sort of absent-mindedly conveying thoughts through your attention and through your consciousness, and just allowing that process to take place. And all of these things, again, there's a wealth of evidence supporting the benefits of mindfulness. And, other examples, breath-focused exercise, for example, deliberately trying to breathe in a focused, diaphragmatic way. More information about that in episode 1. Coordinating breath with footsteps, for example, and also just an encouragement to practice mindfulness throughout daily tasks. And the idea of mindfulness is that it kind of generally increases one's psychological health. And there's a wealth of information online that you can find about mindfulness, and I do recommend looking more into it. There's kind of evidence that it can help with developing positive eating behaviors and therefore having a good diet, getting rid of binge drinking, supporting impulse control, helping with substance use disorders, helping with tobacco smoking, helping the kind of self-management of chronic illness. For example, mindfulness training can actually lower blood glucose levels. Another piece of evidence in the massive repertoire of evidence that there's a strong connection between mind and body. Mindfulness can reduce violence, thoughts of suicide, self-injury, other kind of high-risk behaviors. It's in fact been incorporated in either directly or indirectly in lots of different modalities of therapy. For example, dialectical behavior therapy or acceptance and compassion therapy. So mindfulness, one of the important things that we can do to achieve happiness. Another important thing, another related thing that we can do to achieve happiness is this idea of savouring. What is savouring? Savouring is the ability to recall, to dwell on, and to, as the name suggests, savour satisfying events. And savouring can be divided into 3 orientations. There's anticipatory savouring, which involves looking forward to future events in order to generate a positive feeling in the moment. There's reminiscent savouring, which involves thinking back to pleasant events in order to generate positive emotions again. And there's finally savouring the present moment, where it occurs during a moment where you're fully aware of the pleasant and the positive nature of the moment, and you really dwell on it, and you really live in the moment and try and experience it to the maximum. So savouring really is a form of emotional regulation. And there's lots of studies on savouring, although less so as on mindfulness. There's also some studies on the benefits of savouring in during the COVID-19 the COVID-19 pandemic, and how it had a positive kind of protective role in maintaining positive effect and helped ward away negative effect. So savouring and mindfulness two important things for the pursuit of happiness. Again, I encourage doing your own research. And finally, just something else to talk about at last is positive psychology interventions. And these are just things which are created by positive psychology researchers. And positive psychology, again, we talked about a lot in the last episode, these kind of things that people can do in order to make them happier. So for example, savouring is a classic example of a positive psychology intervention, wherein a person is encouraged to sort of grab every little aspect of experience. Physical, sensory, emotional, social. The idea of savouring can be connected to everyday experiences such as eating, smelling, going for a walk, stopping to smell some flowers. And there's actual evidence that these can be used to help treat depression and mood disorders. Gratitude interventions that I've kind of talked about, really important as well. Both self-reflective practices, such as keeping a gratitude journal, and also interactive practices where people actively express gratitude to others and give small tokens of appreciation, kind of shown to be really helpful. An idea of another kind of positive psychology intervention is a kindness booster, focusing on compassion, encouraging simple acts like buying someone a small token of love, volunteering for some kind of good cause, donating something, helping a stranger in need. All of these have been proven scientifically to increase people's happiness. The idea being that morality and happiness are strongly and scientifically shown to be linked. Meditation, mindfulness, self-love meditation, but also meditation called loving kindness meditation that kind of aims to encourage love for other people as well. Very important as well. Another kind of PPI is a test called the Imagine Yourself test, where participants are asked to note down where they see themselves in future and to encourage kind of positive thought and anticipatory savouring. Also, strength building measures. So for example, educating people to be aware of their own kind of power to shape their own levels of happiness. So giving people practical wisdom or information on positive psychology is itself a positive intervention. Giving people activities that can kind of help them find meaning, or meaning-oriented PPIs in general, such as helping people set goals and employ means to achieve these goals, can also be quite sort of very important in the achievement of happiness. There's just a massive myriad of different interventions utilized in positive psychology that can help people utilize happiness. And they're all based in one way or another on this SOLARSE formula that we've talked about. And of course, just to bring up the Buddha again, because not only is a lot of this new positive psychology stuff not based on, but implicitly or explicitly inspired from Buddhist practices, but the Buddhist ideas of mindfulness and savouring. I mean, mindfulness was a Buddhist idea before it was a Western scientific idea. In this case, there is a direct inspiration from the philosophy of Buddhism. Obviously, Buddhism is a religion as well, but by the philosophy of Buddhism, I just mean the viewpoint, the worldview, and the set of practices of Buddhism. There is a real link here between Buddhism and the sciences. Now, one of the most important aspects of Buddhism is the idea of self-transcendence and finding meaning, which we've been talking about a lot in this episode and previous episodes. But next episode, I'm going to be dedicating a whole episode just to the acquisition of meaning and talking to a lesser extent about self-transcendence, because it's just so important for happiness, and in the idea of eudaimonic well-being, which we talked about in the beginning of the episode. Ladies and gentlemen, that has been this episode. I sincerely hope you have enjoyed it, and I wish you a lovely day. Take care.